this is the part that I hope has changed, is to be aware of the places where it doesn't work. To be aware of the place where that one heuristic for thinking about energy systems is not applicable.
Welcome to Power Map, the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program podcast, where we explore the forces reshaping the global energy system. I'm Quill Robinson.
And I'm Joseph Mikett.
Joseph, so this week we had Nat Bullard join us to discuss deep decarbonization. So Nat is the co-founder of Halcyon, an AI-assisted platform that helps businesses navigate the energy transition. He's also the managing director of Business Climate, which is a specialized consultancy. And Nat spent around 15 years at Bloomberg NEF. But what he's most famous for is this massive slide deck that he releases each year that lays out different trends in decarbonization.
It's always a pleasure to talk to Nat. He's been a friend of our program for years. And one of the things I think is most special, we touched on this in our conversation with him, is that product, he now communicates by slide deck. He used to be a weekly columnist. That product is sort of his sole vision, especially as we think about this podcast and trying to understand not just the facts, but the frameworks that people use to interpret them. I can think of no more perfect first guest than Nat, because in this deck, you get his thesis. This is his view of the world. There's an editorial through line, despite the fact that it is all charts made from open data and respected sources. You can see how one of the world's top experts is taking all this input and building a picture of the state of the energy system, its technology, its economics, its politics, everything. Of course, speaking with him is just absolutely a pleasure.
I couldn't agree more. I think he was the exact right first guest. And I think something that we really want to tease out in this podcast, given that these topics can be so fraught, that there is so much mistrust in experts and institutions at this moment, is just being very transparent about what people's frameworks are. And I think Nat did a really good job of explaining that.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to ask you, we studied the deck, we talked to Nat. Looking back on our conversation, what really stuck with you?
Totally. I think the first thing that comes to mind, Joseph, was how much 2024 was a year of contrasts. And that's something that we go into detail in the episode with Nat. But the fact that we saw record global coal consumption last year, more than ever before. At the same time, we saw over $2 trillion of investment in the global energy transition. And that's just 4 or 5 years ago, that was less than $1 trillion. So those are two data points that are significant and tell big stories, but are seemingly at odds. And we get into this as well, sort of these meta-narratives about the energy transition is charging ahead, no matter what, and cannot be stopped by policy or changes in politics. On the other hand, the energy transition is a lie, like it's just sort of, the deployment of renewables is just meeting additional demand, that neither of those really capture the nuance of what is going on in the global energy system.
How does that change your framework, Quill? What in that has made you think differently about the state of the world or where the U.S. and the world are going?
I think we need to be able to hold multiple stories in mind at once. And also the fact that these stories are quite diverse based on where you're looking, right? The energy trajectory of East Asia is very different from the U.S., is very different from Europe. And certainly it's helpful to compare and contrast and understand what factors are shaping those trajectories. But there isn't a singular story about the global energy system that we can tell.
I hear that. You mentioned 2024 as a year of contrasts. Cost inflation is driving huge electoral swings, big pushbacks on ESG. We talked about that stuff with Nat. What were your takeaways on the status of climate as a political, social entity from our discussion?
Well, that's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and has been a big part of my career, as you know. Nat made a really interesting point about 2021 having some notable peaks when it came to climate. The number of mentions in corporate reports of climate change and ESG sort of peaked. The amount of climate litigation peaked in 2021. 2022 has gone down precipitously since. I think as a political issue, particularly in the United States and in the West more generally, climate was so front of mind at that moment for voters and in the discourse, and it really propelled President Biden into the White House. But then quite quickly in more recent years, I think it's declined, and we've had to contend with inflation, with energy security concerns. And so the tone of the conversation has changed dramatically. At the same time, Nat makes the really important point that climate is not out of the vernacular of corporate boardrooms and CEOs, and ESG has not been stricken from every corporate strategy. It's still present. It's still important. It's still a consideration of theirs, but perhaps it's not as front of mind as it was in that sort of strange moment of 2021, 2022.
Yeah, I hear that. I think one of the things that really stuck with me from the conversation was the extent to which these sort of numerous transitions that are going on and the rapid technological progress that we're seeing is really shifting where energy investments are being made, how countries are developing energy systems. And in particular, we spent a lot of time with him as well on the role of China.
All right, Joseph, let's dive into the conversation.
Look forward to it.
Nat Bullard, welcome to Power Map. It's good to have you.
Well, thanks for having me. And Joseph, good to see you again, and good to be speaking with you again.
Nice to see you again as well, Nat. Hope you're doing well.
Now, you started in Decatur, Georgia. You're now in Singapore. Before we dive into the slide deck and all the different wonky topics that we're hoping to cover today, can you tell us a little bit about your journey, from where you started to where you're at now?
It involved a lot of airplane flights. I'm born and raised in Georgia. I always like to quote Ulysses S. Grant's autobiography, in fact, where he says, "My family is American and has been for many generations in all its branches, direct and collateral. I grew up in the Deep South. After finishing my college time in New England, I decided to take it on the road a little bit. I had the chance to go live in Cairo, teach at an American school there. 2001 academic year. I came back to New York City for a few years, back to Europe for graduate school, the first year of my program, at a school that many of your listeners will find very familiar, Johns Hopkins SAIS. Did a bit more time in D.C., working at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And prior to that, New Energy Finance, a startup that was founded in Europe, and I joined in 2007. Took it on the road again, did some time in San Francisco, a few years in Hong Kong, D.C. Again, in the last couple of years, I've been here in Singapore. Almost that entire time, postgraduate school, I've been working in the field of energy, climate, decarbonization, purely as an analyst. I wouldn't consider myself a practitioner of anything because I am not devoting capital. I am not making strategic planning decisions nor enacting them. I'm merely an observer. I used to do this, as I alluded, within the body of this great big research group within an even bigger information services company, and I now do this on my own.
Nat, so Joseph and I get to talk to a lot of interesting analysts who have a global perspective. But I'm curious, what does the climate and energy world look like from Singapore specifically?
I appreciate being here for a sort of parallax view. You're looking at all of the same information. You're just seeing it differently. You're seeing it refracted, if you will, if you're staring at it through water and with a lens, so to speak. What I think is very important to note here is the outsized role that Asia Pacific plays in anything related to energy and climate. Within that, of course, China plays its own outsized role, both regionally and globally. But also, I think you have to have a very realistic assessment of where the present moment is, where we actually are in terms of the state of technology development and deployment and the capital and the policy that supports all of that, but also have a better sense of what is possible in terms of changing trajectories that need changing. Your listeners are probably well familiar with this, but I still find it surprising that I have to note to people that for all the progress that's been made in the United States and Europe and within the OECD as a sort of larger umbrella in terms of reducing our emissions and reducing some, along with it, consumption of fossil fuels, we have math that is stacking up in other parts of the world that, for good reason, are building us into a very challenging carbon position in terms of the future. And I just think that being here in Asia gives you a better view of where we are at the moment and a better appreciation of the challenges. But again, a better appreciation, too, of what possible can look like. When you change these systems that are so big, that will have bigger material impacts than a lot of what's already happened so far in the OECD.
How has that changed your thinking? Do you see opportunity for faster changes in the energy system, given your current seat, or slower ones?
This is a great question. I think I see a faster chance for technology improvement and deployment, but a higher ladder to climb, using those new levers in technology to change the sort of brute force math of atmospheric carbon dioxide levels and the emissions that play into them. Tech moves really fast here, but the math is moving at its own slower but inexorable pace to build us into a carbon situation that we have to do a lot of work to get out of.
One of the things that is so interesting about your deck is it shows us in graphical, gory, excruciating detail both the challenges associated with climate change and the changes in the energy system that are happening for a variety of reasons, right? Some of which you just alluded to. What is it about a deck that gives you the key insights that we're looking for? Like one of the things we try to understand talking to folks like you is organizing principles in their head for how they think about these problems. Why is it a deck that you have arrived on as the vehicle for your expressing your thinking?
It's a good question. And I'm curious, actually, that I don't think I've been asked that before, because as both of you know, I spend an awful lot of time writing as well. I did a 10-year stint writing a column every week for BNEF and then for Bloomberg Opinion and Bloomberg Green for an audience of like hundreds of thousands of people. This kind of work, though, I find is complementary because it actually offers a challenging composition to people's thinking in a useful way, which is that it's empirical, but it can also contain nuance. It is a set of things that are true. And you'll notice that throughout the 200 slides that I have, almost none of them have any projection beyond a year or 2 or 3. And if so, they come from canonical sources. They come from a government. They come from the International Energy Agency. They come from a state planning or a state research institute. There are things that are, if not binding, then at least very well informed and consensus accepted, as generally accepted. And so I think about this as like the numbers are the numbers. You can't really argue with them. You can debate them or you can disagree with them, but they are true. The numbers are there and there's no really fighting them. However, you can delve into elements of them in specific ways. And this is where the interpretation comes into it. We did 8.771 billion tons of coal consumption in the world last year. That's a big, scary number. China's more than half of that. But let's decompose that further into sort of manageable, useful subsets of figures that are important. As I alluded, how is the OECD done? How much of the growth is India? If you strip out China, where is the challenge that we need to meet and where is the opportunity to be had? And these are all things that you can do numerically with in edits to them in terms of what you choose to highlight, what you choose to emphasize. But the numbers are the numbers. And I find that this is a good way to convey a lot of dense statistical information to people very quickly. To be very clear, I'm not doing peer-reviewed research. I'm very rigorous about my sourcing, but I'm not going through peer review. I'm not going through an interagency process. I no longer work with an editor, though I oftentimes ask people to check my work. But it's a very good way, I think, to go through a lot of information at once. And also, I find that deck format is quite interoperable. So I create information that comes from one domain, one geography, one sector, but you can plug it into a story that incorporates information from other places at the same time. And it's fairly fungible. Like there's probably a way to tell some of the same story with different information or to move the sequencing of the slides around to do whatever you want. But mostly it's a way to let us begin these very important inquiries about the future with a shared understanding about the present. It's interesting. I spent a lot of time in the business of long-term projections and helping people do long-term planning. And as you both know, you can get essentially enraptured into model metaphysics, talking to somebody about what your discount rate is or what you assume for the cost of capital or things like that are both important, but can also completely consume a discussion of the long future. And so I very deliberately made a choice to not do any of that and simply settle on where we are at the moment with a minor amount of projection. So a very brief digression here that I think your listeners will appreciate because it actually comes from finance, but it's really relevant for a geopolitical context. There are scenarios, there are projections, and there are forecasts. A scenario is a story that we tell ourselves. In the energy world, these are things such as Shell's global energy scenarios where they look ahead what the future might look like. There are projections, which is work such as a lot of more statistically oriented places and especially research shops do, which is here's what the future might look like, assuming X, Y, Z. And it's generally very numbers driven more than it is sort of story driven. And then there are forecasts, which is what governments do and what companies do, looking out somewhere between 6 to 24 or maybe 36 months. This is what we expect things to be. This is where we expect the federal funds rate to be. This is what we expect our earnings to be if I'm a company in the next quarter. This is what I'm projecting as earnings per share or free cash flow in the next couple of months. These are things that are more binding. They're not legally binding, but they are sort of more intellectually binding. And so what I've decided to do is not do scenarios, although I find them very useful. I don't do them. Projections, as I said, you can get enraptured into model metaphysics talking about those. Forecasts, I do take on occasion, but for the most part, I'm just saying, nope, what has already happened? Where are we? And my last thought on this is that I have a pretty wide aperture, as you can see. The value, I think, is having that kind of rigor in the lens that you apply. I'm only going to use the stuff that has happened to date and cast it very widely across all of these surfaces at once, as opposed to sector by sector narrative or vertical, if you will, that only looks at, the auto sector and has both a load of historic information and then a couple of forecasts from companies or forecasters, and then long projections into the future. I'm doing this horizontally and stopping essentially at the present moment.
Nat, so you mentioned this is not a 100-page academic paper. This is not a massive spreadsheet. It is a 200-page slide deck. How would you recommend the uninitiated tuck in?
So I make a very deliberate decision on this. I have it as a linear narrative. It's online. You can go and you can click through. I do not make it downloadable for a number of reasons. One is that very basically, as an information provider, lose all telemetry on it the moment that it's outside of my purview. You can watermark and timestamp and whatever kind of steganographic incantation you want onto these things, but they have a way of leaking. It's hosted on my site, and you just click through page by page. I do have engagements with people when they want to talk about it more specifically, but really, I'd like people to flow through it as a narrative and then come back. I deliberately did not put a table of contents in there because then people just skip ahead to the part that they want. I didn't put an index in it so that people would just go to the back and look for the thing that they're looking for. And it's interesting, I've had this debate in a sort of impassioned and polite way with a lot of people in the sector who say, you know what, it would be more useful if you put an index or a table of contents. And I said, well, maybe for you, but not for me. I do want people to have a sense of a narrative that is constructed and that has some linearity to it. And the reason that that's important to me is that there are areas that are very logical constructions. Let's talk about the auto sector and let's talk about the power sector. But then there are others that this year around are not, which is thinking, for instance, about, I have a section called It's a 2021 Thing. The fact that a whole lot of energy and climate commitments got made during a very unusual moment in politics, culture, society, capital markets. And I want people to reflect on that. That's not something that you would go and naturally think of as a lens of inquiry. If you come at this as an investment banker, you're going to go and say, well, all I care about is M&A in the auto sector, so I'm just going to go to the auto section. So I want to preserve some sense of narrative to it. And look, to be very clear, there's tons of leakage on this already, and in a good way. I was notified on Twitter by somebody was highlighting a professor's presentation that had my slides in it, captured full frame, and just pasted in there, to which I say, great. It's got built-in citations on the right side, and it's got my word mark in it. So as long as those are in there, I'm fine. I've had plenty of people snip out the word mark and the sourcing, and it's pretty funny because there are other elements of the style that are pretty standard to me, like the colorway and the way that I write and all these kinds of things. And occasionally I'll rib people a little bit and say things like, wow, where did you ever get this information? Or like, it's amazing that this kind of thing is public. And eventually people will back down and say, like, yeah, I probably shouldn't have just trimmed all of your attributions out of it. But no, look, I make it public for a reason because the information is itself a matter of public record. Another way that this is different from research that might be paywalled is that I'm using the data and the analysis in many ways that other people have compiled. If I was receiving it free, I have no problem conveying it in the same fashion.
What is, I think, quite laudable about the effort, one, we shouldn't always make our products as easy to access as possible. Sometimes you want people to do a little work to receive the wisdom therein. And secondly, the fact that you are using open data sets means that for many of us in this world, right, we are constantly bombarded by inputs, by talking points, by some chart. That can be very confusing. It can be a noisy information environment. I've seen versions of many, many of these charts in different places, in different contexts, but having a unitary sole editor go through and try to both connect them narratively or cognitively and display the information, kind of scalarly, appropriately, and a whole bunch of other things actually really does help to sort of understand as you're shifting between these different things, kind of what's going on. I think both of those are elements of this product that make it now, people wait for the Nat's deck to drop like it's new Nikes.
It is very strange to me that people are waiting for this to happen. I'm certainly appreciative of it. And I actually really appreciate your observation on that in terms of the sort of the sole editor nature of it, because it's very true. Interestingly, you would think this would be much easier to do within, say, a 20,000 person information system business, but it's not, because it's very, very hard to maintain a through line when you have lots of people that, for good reason, want to contribute to it and want to be part of it. It helps to have one person's hand on the tiller in terms of shaping a narrative. Of course, there would be places where it'd be really nice to have help in the physical construction of this, right? The actual shoe leather work of compiling it. But even that part, I don't really mind. It's part of the effort to build something that hopefully feels like part of a unitary whole. It doesn't feel like, well, we grabbed stuff from this department and then that department kicked in. You'll notice over time that the very best research houses have a house view and a house style, and then they have a kind of house vibe that really is important. Y'all are the same way. You know immediately that I goes like this work came from you, and I know that it's the product of a team and a strategy and a culture that works in this way. And people come to expect that. It's a great position of trust when you've earned it, because people coming to you for a reason, but they've also given you the permission framework to challenge them when the time is right.
Right. Let's dive into a little bit of this year's deck. You give us a state estimate. It's a backward look for the most part, as you said. If I sort of scan across the deck, 2024 saw positive and negative indicators for a lot of different things. The number of extremely hot days has doubled since 1980. Record GHG emissions from fossil fuels. Record global coal consumption. On the other hand, record investment into clean energy and clean energy infrastructure globally. And global renewables deployment is continuing to grow rapidly. So what is the implicit thesis statement for 2024?
It's great. Actually, it's weird. You spend a lot of time sort of starting at a position, thinking on it, and I come right back to the same position, which is that both of these things are true, and we have to maintain them as true and not try to make them contradictory. That we are in a situation in which we both installed 600 gigawatts of solar in 1 year, which is a number so outlandish to young analyst me that I wouldn't even know where to begin. I would think it was fake, or I would say, okay, so I guess the sort of the new unified world government of 2024 imposed the $400 new a ton carbon tax on all economic activity. And then I would also find out that we burned 8.7 billion tons of coal. And then I would say, okay, so we have a world GDP of $300 billion now, or we're on like whatever new rung of the Kardashev scale we are on in terms of going as an extraplanetary civilization. I could try to come up with a complicated way of thinking about this, but the simple one is that you just have to keep these both bounded in domain. And weirdly, you have to think to yourself that these things so far at the global level are both moving apace. And that's tricky. They're not moving apace in Europe. They're not moving apace in the U.S. Decarbonization of parts of economic activity are definitely decarbonizing the totality of the economy to some degree, or they're reducing the carbon intensity of it. But at the global level, it's not happening. China is the perfect example in which it both has had a massive run-up in renewable power and a massive run-up in coal-fired power. It is the world's biggest auto market and the world's biggest EV market, biggest auto exporter and the world's biggest EV exporter, biggest oil importer. It is the world's second biggest oil market. All of these things are true at once, and they are not yet contradictory. The challenge is to observe the moments. The one might start to inform the other. The two different sides of the ledger play against each other. The deeper challenge beyond that is to sort of think about what that might mean. What does it mean, for instance, when China is no longer the persistent put option for anybody any major oil exporter, right? What happens if they're no longer importing as much? There are lots of things that we can think about going forward from today, but only if we start with the best information we have about the moment.
I feel like I read a LinkedIn post one day that says the energy transition is fake and here's why. And the next day I read one, the energy transition is real and it's going faster than ever and here's why. Do you feel like we've done ourselves a disservice by describing it as a transition? Do you like that phrase? Does it insufficiently capture the contradiction here, or what's your take on that?
Well, this is an important question because, not to get too sort of semantic about it, but we should ask ourselves whether energy transition is an observation or an aspiration. In places, it is an observation. In all of the economies that have managed to decouple economic growth with fossil fuel emissions, including the fossil fuel emissions that they import in the form of products from elsewhere. In that case, you can say yes. At the global level, I would say it is still an aspiration. You could say the same thing about decarbonization for that matter. It is episodically or specifically an observation, depending on where you're observing. And it is generally an aspiration in terms of what people hope to have happen. Back a couple of years ago, I talked about how we were in this era of alternative and renewable energy that then moves to sort of energy transition that then moves to, and this is very much a kind of 2021 idea, then we move on to net zero. That is obviously aspirational, but people sort of attach their thinking on multiple business cycles towards making the aspiration into something that is observed and that is real. It is a really good question, and I hope that for the planners and policymakers out there, this conversation is useful in terms of how we think about it, is that depending on where you're looking, it's either a specific observation that we can say empirically is true, or it's a general aspiration we're hoping to have occur elsewhere. There are a lot of arguments that basically we're only additive with the things that we consume. I mean, I have a slide in here about how much of the world's round wood gets used for fuel. 50% of the wood that we harvest today is fuel, which is way down from what it used to be, but half of all of the world's wood is still burned up, not made into products of some kind. We're at a place where we're consuming so much more energy and we're looking to consume so much more, specifically electricity in the coming years, that we may not be in the position yet where renewables can do anything more than maintain the kind of fossil fuel consumption balance today for a couple of years. So the IEA, the International Energy Agency, says we're looking at about a 4% year-on-year growth in electricity demand, which does not sound like a big number, but again, to borrow the IEA's phrasing, it's a Japan of electricity consumption to be added every year. And that's a very, very high bar to clear with just renewable power, which is why we see all these other sources still growing. What I think is really interesting is to think which of these fuels is going to go first. Because the narrative for the longest time has been it's going to be coal, right? Coal's the dirtiest. It's the one with the from which we get the most emissions. And oil is going to be very hard to displace, so that's not going to happen. And then gas is the bridge or transition fuel. The reality is that we are so highly geared to what a couple of countries decide to do at a high level energy plus policy aspect regarding coal, that's one that might be really hard to call in the future. Whereas oil, which has so many more point sources of demand around the world, may be the one that actually hits its peak first, right? I've already alluded to China's apparent oil demand. It is so outsized as a driver of global increase of demand for oil that changes there will have a lot of resonance, right? Another way to put it is if China manages to reduce its oil consumption by a third, where else in the world are we going to make up 5 million barrels a day of oil demand in the future with all of those things that we've been given, in particular on road transport to decarbonize that, now propagating around the world?
And it's not even decarbonization, right? As you mentioned earlier, excess capacity for its domestic market of Chinese auto manufacturing at 15 million units a year, set to grow. And that's not coming to the United States. Some of it goes to Europe. A lot of it is going into emerging markets, where I think we would have expected the sort of normal progression of fossil fuels, then the fancy clean stuff. skipping the wires and going right to mobile telephony kind of moment for a lot of people in emerging markets would totally upend all of the scenarios and forecasts that we've talked about for years, but is just sort of emerging out of the reality.
There are so many things downstream of the auto complex that we're describing right now and where it sits that I think have been incompletely explored. I did not have time to put this in this year's deck, but I did manage to capture that China's about 40% of global passenger vehicle production. Interestingly, the people I find that have the hardest time seeing that as a big deal are the ones who have some experience with the auto industry in the 80s with Japan. But Japan peaked at only about 30%. And not only that, it was not operating in a scenario where it had this insane overhang of spare production capacity that it could be devoting somewhere else. The question that you raise is a really good one. What is it that China is going to be exporting? Because right now it's more than 50% are internal combustion engine vehicles that it exports. But clearly the urge and the impetus is to be doing more and more EVs. And where does the $10,000 EV go in Southeast Asia? And what does that do to choose your fighter? The auto markets of Thailand and Malaysia, where you have very large manufactories and you have a lot of capability being a supplier to a supplier, providing labor. What happens to that? What happens to the used vehicle market in the OECD if no one wants to buy your used Camry and ship it to West Africa? What happens to all of those vehicles? Like, do they exit the scene very quickly? Is it the U.S., paradoxically, that's the world that's trapped with 15-year-old used vehicles, while Mexico and Brazil are the places that are driving brand new, competitively priced EV or an extended range EV pickups and vans? I don't think people have sort of approached this very challenging position very well yet, just because it's so complicated. Got so many things that we need to game out. And interestingly, I'm sort of doing right now, what we're doing right now, what I hope people would do after reading the presentation is look at the moment, look at the shape of these lines, and think about what the implications might be for the future.
I want to keep mucking about in the scenario and murky scenario and forecast territory, but I really want to make sure we don't skip over 2021. Did we hit peak climate in 2021, 2022? Climate litigation peaked during that period. Mentions of ESG in corporate calls is down by a third of what it was during that period. Was that just a strange moment where we fooled ourselves into thinking that climate change truly was the top political issue in the US and in the Western world? Or is this going to reemerge in a few years as a galvanizing political priority, and maybe in a different shape?
The 2021 thing, which is what I called it in the deck, is just that we have all these, as you've alluded to, we have all these kind of little factors and in many ways rhetorical framings for thinking about what's happening in the larger context, not just of climate, but in particular of environmental social governance investing, and in the ways that we plan or don't plan to build for the future. And to some extent, the expectation that people have for the future that we're going to rapidly decarbonize, and therefore that's what we prioritize. I'll give you another reading on this. There's a very good friend here in the Asia Pacific region who is a longtime analyst and a very dedicated and thoughtful investor who said, did all this stuff happen just because we were stuck at home during COVID and we didn't have anything else to do? There's some truth to that observation, which is that these are the sorts of things that we could focus on at a time when we had a sort of natural pullback in the demand for the forcing function sides of climate change. I find that kind of beguiling and kind of fascinating to think about. I think the reality is that markets think in narratives, and there was this narrative that all of these things can be sort of allied and grouped together within one frame, and that ESG is part of that. ESG is a set of screens or a set of lenses on companies. It is not necessarily a set of drivers for fundamental activity. And I think people conflated the two to some extent. But there are a lot of things in here that I want people to also remember, that a lot of these sort of rhetorical elements around climate might have diminished, but the flows still tend to be there. So Fundraising for ESG assets definitely peaked in 2022, alternative assets. So those are things that are not just traded equities. That fundraising definitely peaked in 2022, but it also increased 2024 from 2023. It didn't go to zero. A lot of these things are just sort of retrenching to kind of like a more sensible level. A lot of commitments, for instance, around EV and battery manufacturing peaked in the US in 2022, to a large extent because that's all that the market can absorb. Formation of startups in carbon dioxide removal. There are 500 of them now. And yes, the peak year for their formation is 2021. It's healthy that we have a lot of this activity, but it's also at the same time, I think, inevitable that some of these things have to return either to ground if they're not going anywhere, or they have to sort of wait and see what they've determined is the next steady state. We need millions of pathways, not millions, we need dozens of pathways for thinking about removing carbon dioxide. So we have 500 companies set up to do them, but we may not need another 500 companies yet until some of these pathways start to be proven out, and you have a proliferation of ways to not just prove a concept, but actually enact it.
Point well taken on the market dynamics and that there's an equilibrium to be found. And perhaps some of the folks in the Trump administration who are standing over the body of ESG, declaring woe to the vanquished, are a little too confident. You also mentioned in the deck how local ordinances on banning renewables development has quadrupled in the last 5 years as well. So I'm curious about the policy side of this and how that may constrain sort of a return to the mean through the market.
The policy element of this is massive. We can't assume away the fact that someone in Ohio doesn't want solar on their neighbor's property. We need to find better ways of dealing with that fact and the implications thereof in terms of what it means for building. I would say that combating local stuff needs to be done locally. And I sit on top of the information flows and read all the time what people say about, this titular project in Ohio that you would want to be building and the arguments for and against them. More important for us is what we can do at the regulatory level to make things move faster. This is the shibboleth of permitting reform that keeps coming up and dancing around. But to be very clear, it is extremely important. It is the ne plus ultra. Like, without these things, we will not be able to enact our climate goals. I worry in particular in the United States that there's a bit of a fantasy impression that we can somehow not grow our way towards all of the kind of industrial transformation we need to do if we want to both have a growing economy, which we do, and we want it to decarbonize insofar as possible, which we do want, and we want to remain globally competitive. It requires building things. It's very unneighborly in the global sense, or the more macro sense, to sort of assume that making a very localized decision to not build something for your own benefit doesn't impact other people, because it does.
Now, if Joseph and I were to take a trip down to the Forrestal building and see Secretary Wright or maybe Secretary Burgum or Administrator Zeldin, and we were to drop off a copy of this deck and you got to highlight a couple of the pages, which ones would those be?
Ooh. We screenshotted all the slides, Nat, and then we're going to print them with our logo on them, just to be clear.
Right.
Properly accredited to the CSI.
Sidebars. Take the sidebar out, right? Take the sidebar out. I would ask you to highlight any slides that speak to just the speed and consistent improvement in technologies over time. I would ask you to ask them questions about things such as, what are your contacts telling you in terms of the speed and price point with which they can get a gas turbine, for instance? How much they're actually interested in drilling on federal land. One thing that's, I think, really important to remember, and I say this in the most neutral way possible because it's a neutral statement, is that, of course, any entity wants a call option on the future. So you want, of course, a greater ability to possibly enact something. You want the ability, for instance, to go drill on the North Slope, but you can't will that into existence. We have one of the great things about the United States as an energy economy is that it's incredibly inventive, and it is very market-based. And this is why I think it's really important to look at the way the oil and gas sector behaves, not what it says. If the U.S. was to drill and produce an extra 2.5 or 3 million barrels of oil a day, that's more than we demand by far. What producer has an interest in that? They have their own very basic math. They have a break-even cost, and they have free cash flow expectations, and their investors have free cash flow expectations. If we were to add, 10 or 15% more oil production, where's it supposed to go? If we want to move quickly, what technologies are ready to move quickly in now? What do we need to unlock? We have this advantage in the U.S. that on an uncovered basis, if you let people build, they will probably build what works best. Gas, a lot of that would be in renewables that moves quickly.
And we have the closest thing to a natural experiment available to us, which is Texas and the ERCOT grid, where by and large markets drive all this decision making. And there you get capacity expansions of solar, quite a lot of storage, a little bit of wind, and some gas. And if you think like, what is easy to build quickly? That seems like the portfolio.
The only other one that could actually match that is California, probably in terms of total scale and total capability.
Right.
And, you look in Texas and you can see so quickly that, as you alluded to the battery element in Texas, one of the things that fascinates me is that in the course of a couple of years, the battery energy storage systems writ large in Texas have completely dominated one aspect of energy services. Like in a couple of years, they've gone from basically nothing to more than 3/4 of the market for regulation up and regulation down service in the grid, which is basically one of the aspects of maintaining stability, because they're better, because they work very well. And Texas has great data, and the data providers who cover Texas have great data that they have high availability, the batteries. They work really, really well when it's very, very hot and when it's very, very cold. There are things that you can plan and schedule. And so no one's doing this activity out of anything other than economic interest, which I think is hugely advantageous as we use that as, to use to your term, Joseph, a natural experiment.
This has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. I just want to close with one final question for you. Joseph asked about your organizing principles, sort of your framework at the beginning. I wanted to ask you, after 2 decades of working in this space, of focusing on deep decarbonization, has your framework, have your organizing principles changed at all?
I'm hopefully have become as rigorous as possible about looking for the edge cases that might become the center. In a sense, that's how I began looking at the solar sector as an analyst in the United States. This is the part that I hope has changed, is to be aware of the places where it doesn't work. To be aware of the place where that one heuristic for thinking about energy systems is not applicable. Quick example would be thinking about the battery sector, where there really is a set of differentiators by application in a way that in solar, one technology path has kind of dominated almost all use cases. But batteries are not going to be that way. It would be very easy to tell myself that story that this technology is going to dominate there. But it's maybe hopefully very vigilant and diligent in not only where things might go along the path that I recognize from other places and other technologies, but also where it might not.
Well, Nat, thank you so much for joining us on PowerMap.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me.
Thank you.